So what I'm going to talk about a little bit for the next few minutes is understanding soil health in the future in agriculture, something that's been coined the evergreen revolution, and I'll just kind of speak to that here in a minute and just talk about where that comes from. Everybody knows about the green revolutions over the past number of decades. Well, just recently, in 2013, this individual that was involved in molecular microbial ecology of the rhizosphere has coined the next green revolution as the evergreen revolution. And that is something where we're looking at taking a deeper look at the relationship between the microbiome, the rhizosphere of the plant, which we call the gut of the plant, and the interaction between plant and crop production. So what we're looking at in this process here is the success of this particular initiative, the Evergreen Revolution, requires a fundamental base knowledge of healthy, well-managed soils. So how do we get there? How do we actually become or have our soils become a more healthy soil? So what we're doing in this initiative basically is moving to a more ecological front in production agriculture, looking to understand the ecology between the plant, what makes the plant happen, what makes the plant produce what it produces, and just understanding what that relationship is between the plant and the microbiome. So ecological agriculture is practices that require greater reliance on the natural soil processes. Microorganisms, the interactions between plants and human beings, and just what we do in the field. So this is a kind of a different approach, but we call it ecological agriculture. Some of the examples of that, microbial biomass, reserves of nutrients in that microbial biomass that feed the plant, fixation of nutrients by nitrogen-fixing organisms, both nodulating and non-nodulating, disease suppression. We're always looking for the disease suppressive soil, and we think we've actually identified what that is. And then growth promotions or biostimulation, which is a big thing today, people looking for different products to give you that stimulation effect in the field. Again, looking at what is going on in these soils, what are these bugs doing to make these plants fight disease, increase their productivity, just a whole bunch of different things these bugs are doing, and just how can we manage them and how can we make this happen and have some control over that. So what we're looking for, and the long-term goal here, is to produce a better food source, to grow a healthier crop. Everybody's talking about nutrient density today. So basically understanding what we can do in production agriculture to just improve the quality of the food that we produce, that we ultimately will consume globally. Something that a lot of people don't realize is the energy that goes into this and what the plant is actually doing. 20 to 60% of all the photosynthase a plant produces actually ends up in the rhizosphere. So this plant is spending a lot of energy to feed that community of organisms in that rhizosphere, or what we classify as the gut of the plant. These are not by accident. These plants spend a lot of time and effort doing this, and they actually select and create these different compounds that they put back in the rhizosphere to basically stimulate the microbes to do certain things in that rhizosphere. This is just give you an example of some of the things going on. We talk about aggregate stability. A lot of people think aggregate stability is all about organic matter and applying green manures. It really comes from the plant itself. This is a picture of a root that is basically surrounded by pieces of soil, particles of soil, that are adhering to that root hair, or those root hairs, by a polysaccharide that's emitted by the plant. So if you have a healthy system, your microbiome's healthy, this plant is actually secreting polysaccharides and other compounds that give you that aggregate stability. So the plant can actually create that itself. When we started looking at soil health and looking at solutions to understanding this microbiome, we did offer the Haney test. Anybody use the Haney test? Anybody know what the Haney test is all about? Nobody? Well, that's why we don't offer it much anymore, because nobody really took up on it. So we have this, and we have this test. We really didn't give recommendations based on it, but there's a lot of information coming out of the US on the Haney test. And this is just an example of one of the soil tests that we've done using the Haney test. Some of the work we're doing today, when I started the company back in '84, I met this individual, George Lazarzovitz. Anybody know George? Heard of George? For those that don't know him, he's the guy on the left. He was involved with my partners on their farm looking at ways of solving scab issues and quality issues on potatoes and looking at what's going on in the soil itself. Ever since that time, I've had a real relationship with George on looking at the microbiome, what are the bugs doing in the soil, how can we suppress disease, how can we do a better job, and just kind of overall explanation of and his role of looking at the soil biome and microbiome and plant production. George and I had a kind of a love-hate relationship. I thought you could do everything through nutrition. He's a pathologist, I'm a physiologist. He thought it was all about disease and there's not much you could do. So we had this back and forth on a regular basis. George was working at that time, later in his career at A&L Canada, looking at trying to understand the microbiome and understand who's there. So him and this individual from NRC, Sean Hemmingson, said, we're going to take a fingerprint of all the soils around the globe at the DNA level to see what the bugs are and what the differences are. We want to be able to tell somebody if they took a soil sample from the Amazon or they took it from southwestern Ontario, where it actually came from. So they did profiling, they did all this fingerprinting, looking at all these different organisms, and what they found was that was not the case. From all the soil samples they took around the globe, they found out that all the soils had exactly the same complement of bugs. Different combinations, but all the same bugs existed in all these different soils. So then the question was, why such a difference in how we produce crops and how these crops are produced or grown? So we started this facility, A&L Biologicals, and we started looking into what is making that happen. How are these plants actually stimulating these different bugs in the bulk soil, these indigenous bugs that are out there? All these bugs in the jug we talk about are all indigenous. We're just collecting them up and trying to cultivate them and then putting them back in the root zone to make them perform. So when we looked at that whole process, we looked at what we're trying to do. Our aim was to look at building soil and root structures to reduce water use, increase nutrient use efficiencies or reduce nutrient requirements, and basically improve plant productivity. Build up organic matter if possible that we've destroyed over the last 75 some years, and again basically create a more rich environment for the plant to grow in, a healthier soil, if you will. And again, all these things hopefully to reduce our input cost and increase the quality of the foods that we produce. We're using molecular diagnostics to do this. We're using this to identify both the beneficial and the pathogenic or detrimental bugs in the soil. So just to understand who's there and figure out using molecular markers of who they are. So what makes a healthy soil? Well, basically, we look at healthy soil. There's the chemistry and all the nutrients in the soil. We're analyzing that, and we're trying to tear everything down and look at everything we possibly can. We're looking at the biology of the plant and trying to understand both the plant biology and physiology and the organisms in the soil that interact with that plant. And again, the overall mineralogy of the soil to come up with how do we influence the structure and what is impacting the structure of that soil and how do we maintain a healthy soil system. So our quest was, first of all, we want to identify these soil microbes that populate the host, both in the soil rhizosphere and as endophytes. How does this plant or host actually select for them? How do they bring them from the bulk soil into the rhizosphere and then again ultimately into the plant? How is the plant responding to them? So what is the relationship between the plant and the organism? What are the unique characteristics of all these different organisms? So we're actually looking at the metabolites that they give off to see what they're stimulating within the plant or what the interaction is. So what are these bugs actually doing? And then what are the forces that maintain these things in equilibrium? In other words, how do we bring them from the bulk soil and bring them into the rhizosphere, and how does the plant use them? So in our analysis, we looked at where these things existed. We found out that initially, these are two different soils, one producing 150 bushel of corn, one 300 bushel. And at first glance, the bugs in the bulk soil and the rhizosphere at day of planting looked basically the same. They had basically the same complement of these organisms. And it wasn't until about 30 or 40 days out that the plant actually started getting rid of some of these. In a high producing area, it became very selective. So the organisms in the rhizosphere and actually into the plant were very unique. In other words, this plant has started to clean up the neighborhood and only select for the bugs that it wanted, and then it start to cultivate them and maintain them, and basically change the complete microbiome. Whereas in the lower producing area, this one, the population that started out in the very early stages, the very diverse population, was pretty much still intact. In other words, there's really no change, and the plant went through the full life cycle with that same population. So in the healthier soil, in the crop that's producing a higher yield, there was a more unique population of bugs in the microbiome that the plant actually selected for and then cultivated. So something really, really uniquely different. When we look at the advantages to us as farmers, these are, again, the two different fields, the high producing area in the blue and the low producing area in the red. In the high producing area, that individual is using about 0.8 to 0.9 pounds of nitrogen to produce, per bushel, to produce his crop, over 300 bushel of corn. In the red area, he's using about 1.8 pounds of total nitrogen. I'm including the mineralizable nitrogen as well out of this field to produce about 160 bushel of corn. So there's a great advantage to again, inputs like nitrogen, something that's also an issue when we talk about environmental contamination of our water courses with nitrate and nitrogen. So some real advantages here if we can start this plant cultivating these different organisms and start fixing some of its own nitrogen. And it's there. So the question we have to ask, if plants could do this, if this is actually happening in soils, why isn't it happening? Why isn't that happening naturally today if that's all that's going on is the plant's bringing in the bugs that it wants? Well, it is. Weeds do that today. We don't have to fertilize weeds, and they do quite well. But see, weeds have evolved over time, and they've retained that phenotypic relationship with the organisms in the soil. In other words, they have the ability to recognize the bugs that they want to help them fix nitrogen or solubilize phosphates or uptake potassium. So they have that built in. We have bred that ability out of the crops we have today. So we've gotten rid of some of that ability in our breeding practices, not understanding this phenotypic relationships. So it's something we have to look at when we go back to our breeding and new genetics. We have to look at how can we reestablish some of these phenotypic relationships. Everybody talks about diversity, and we talk about microbial diversity. And when we start looking at this and going down this path, the understanding was the more diversity, obviously the better things would be, but actually that's not the case. And the plant has demonstrated this to us. It actually gets rid of the diversity. It cleans up the neighborhood and only cultivates and feeds the bugs that it wants to have in that rhizosphere. And that way there's not nearly as much competition for the food source that this plant is trying to supply. So a lot of diversity can actually be a negative effect or a net zero effect. These endophytes that the plant are selecting for and cultivating, bringing to the rhizosphere and essentially bringing up inside the plant, have a very selective diet. They have certain carbon sources. So the carbon source that these bugs are feeding on is actually coming from the plant. And the plant has to have the right nutrition to provide enough nutrient source for these endophytes. And the competition for this food source can be big. So again, the resource is a bit at a risk of not being enough for everybody. In some of the things we're looking at, we look at what's going on as far as the good guys and the bad guys. We look at disease pressures. This past crop season, we saw a lot of things happen out there in the field. Here's a relationship to Fusarium in the rhizosphere and in the plant and the DON toxin produced. So there's a direct correlation here. There's 3 different fields here. You can see as the Fusarium level goes up, the toxin level goes up as well. We look at the influence of other things like pH and calcium, zinc and boron, some of these other nutrients that we supply the plant and the correlation to DON levels in grain, and we see some direct correlations there as well. In the case of calcium levels in fields, up to a 90% correlation to DON levels and increased DON levels in crops based on pH alone. So some of the things we're getting out of the data. What we're doing in our field with some of the inputs. This is residual chemistry in soils, a really direct correlation to the impact of residual chemistry on some of these bugs that suppress the DON toxin in these plants. So we're starting to connect the dots a little bit on what we're doing in production agriculture, what is suppressing some of these disease pressures. And after going through a season like we just did with the incidents of dawn, we're starting to see some of these things add up, and there might be some things that we can actually put into production agriculture and do a better job to control this particular problem that we had this last season. So just giving us some answers. So that gets us to VitTellus, our new soil health. We have released it over a year now. It comes from the Latin word vitalitas, which is means vigor or energy, and then tellus, which means from the earth. So energy or vigor of the earth in the soil test. When we look at what we're doing with VitTellus, it gives us a tool to analyze what's going on in the soil. So when we give you the analysis here, it's a predictive analysis based on the research that we've done, and we really understand, based on some of the algorithms that go into this test, who's actually in the rhizosphere. We can look at that test and tell you, what proportion of the organisms in that rhizosphere is Pseudomonas or Bacillus or Rhizobium or nitrogen fixers, just by the complement of nutrients and some of the analysis we do in that test. So there's over 8 years worth of data that goes into this particular test. We'll be improving on it every year with more research we're doing. But for right now, we have a pretty predictive model. There's over 487 different parameters that go into that algorithm. And this is showing you the predictive yield measured versus actual yield taken out of the field. So an R-squared of about 93, which is pretty darn good for anything in production agriculture when we look at putting the stats together. So that's what the test looks like. Again, a lot of information on there. We've got reactive carbon, we've got potential mineralizable nitrogen on that test result. We've got a number of different parameters here that talk about where these ranges should be for that particular soil type. And again, when you look at this information, and as a grower, you say, well, what can I do to increase my soil health or manipulate or help this plant cultivate that rhizosphere? Anytime you move one of these ranges into the optimum range, you actually increase the soil health or the microbial activity within that rhizosphere into what we call a healthier soil. So it gives you some simple information to help you work towards building a healthier soil. On that report, for those people that are Haney followers, we also have the information from the Haney test, so you can compare, if you have followed that, you can compare the Haney test results you've had in the past to our soil health index. So there's the Haney results here, or the NRCS scorecard, and then you can compare that to our soil health index. So in summary, what we're finding is balanced fertility has a big impact on overall soil fertility and soil health. It has a big impact on how well this plant can actually produce the right carbon source to feed and signal for the right bugs. And there's something we can do about that as far as production agriculture or working within our own system to improve the quality of that rhizosphere and the microbiome that exists in the fields that we work with today. And hopefully, through the work we're doing, that we will continue to get a good understanding of where that's at. The next step is to understand more of the fungi and some of the mycorrhiza that also participate in this whole process. We've had some work on that as well, but for right now, the soil health index is primarily made up of the bacteria or the different bugs in the microbiome that make it up. Our soil health suite of tests, we have a number of different tests, a full suite here of different tests that we provide that look at also aggregate stability and other factors people are looking at, the heavy metals, potential mineralizable nitrogen, carbon to nitrogen ratio. So there's a whole list of things here that if that's what you're used to looking at, that you can ask for us to do. We have also a test here on root microbial profiling we do, and sap analysis as well. We offered that last year. We think a lot of people take us up on that, just because I think it has to be done mid-season and people are too busy. And we'll continue to add to that for people that want to actually profile the bugs that are in the soil. But for the most part, the Soil Health Index gives us a pretty good understanding of who's there and who's making it happen. So tomorrow morning, again at 7:30, we're going to have a breakout session that I'll go through this in a little more detail and answer a lot of questions from anybody who wants to attend. And hopefully we can help you understand what VitTellus is all about and share with you a tool that we think is very valuable for all growers in understanding just how can we make a more productive, healthier soil. So I thank you, and I'll hand it back to Steve.
You hang on to that.